Okay, so this is the second video lecture for Chapter 3, The Orient and Other Others, from Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology. I'm picking up where I left off in the first video, at the transition between page 117 and 118. We're entering into a discussion of Orientalism through the big figure in that canon, Edward Said, and we're talking, I guess, about the reachable as a function of domestication. And Ahmed writes about how groups are formed out of a shared direction, and that a we emerges as an effect of shared direction towards an object. So 118, we get European philosopher Hegel on India as land of desire. And here Ahmed makes the important point that it is not that nations have simply directed their wishes and longings toward the Orient, but rather that the nation coheres as an effect of the repetition of this direction, and that such repetition is not innocent but strategic. That feels like a worthy thing to say again. Such repetition is not innocent but strategic. We were talking about Derrida, archives as homes, ways of gathering material around which worlds gather. If archives allow documents to dwell, then they too are orientation devices, which in gathering things around are not neutral but directive. And that Orientalism is a form of world-facing, which also involves phenomenal space. It is a matter of how bodies inhabit space through shared orientations. I was also talking a little bit about how Ahmed mentions Freud on group formation through shared orientation toward love of the leader. And then 119, shared orientations and the way in which they produce that towards which they are oriented. Quote, in a way, what is faced by a collective is also what it brings into existence. Ahmed reintroduces lines again. You can't be a chapter in this book without having something to say about lines and tables. Lines reappear here as a way of describing modes of following along a path, and also as boundaries, or sort of the horizon line of becoming. And this is where she pivots to talking about Benedict Anderson's idea of nations as imagined communities, in which orientation toward a shared object, for Anderson, the example is print culture, like a newspaper, that produces this imagined community. So the towardness of a public culture which coheres, in the example of Orientalism, around facing the Orient, can help us re-theorize the orientation of Orientalism. Quote, to direct one's gaze and attention toward the other as an object of desire is not indifferent, neutral, or casual. We can describe towardness as energetic. Ahmed then applies her toward/around model toward Orientalism, and how it helps produce not only the ideas of the West and the East, but also shapes how bodies cohere by facing the same direction. And so this is where we turn to the next section, which is about reproducing whiteness. Ahmed, 121, I now want to turn to the spatialization of race by considering how homes and families become racialized in the very direction they take. This is where Ahmed talks about the alignment of race and space that produces whiteness as something that we think of as near or here. Quote, I am talking precisely about the production of whiteness as a straight line rather than whiteness as a characteristic of bodies. Remember, this is, in the previous video, I mentioned that Ahmed is entering into her phenomenology of race through a critique of nominalism and the idea that race is something that inheres in bodies, but rather being something that appears as if it does and is the effect of racialization, that's something different. So, okay, quote. Indeed, we can talk about how whiteness is attributed to bodies as if it were a property of bodies. One um, what of describing this process? One way of describing this process is to describe whiteness as a straightening device. So we're continuing some of the language that got set up in the previous chapter. Orientation devices, in the sense of objects or constructs that not only guide us but guide us in a certain direction. Um, and what I'm thinking of as a subset of orientation devices, which is the straightening device, something which smooths or presses on um, deviation, um, and sort of compels it to not deviate, to straighten out. Ahmed then brings in Alice Weinbaum to talk about the race reproduction bind, in which sexual reproduction and species reproduction are conflated, noting that it might be useful to detach these terms. Um, and, the reason for this is that Ahmed talks about race, family, and likeness, in terms of race being a model that extends the family form. Other members of a given race are considered to be like a family, just as the family itself is defined in racial terms. So if a race is like a family, then a family is of a race. So this is why it's so important to Ahmed to get in the crack between those ideas and widen that out and talk about, um, what Weinbaum talks about as the race reproduction bind. So on 122, Ahmed considers family and racial lines, noting that genealogy itself could be understood as a straightening device, which creates the illusion of descent as a line. Um, and again, the family line establishes what we call a racial line. The desire for connection generates likeness, at the same time that likeness is read as a sign of connection. And the sort of circularity of this reasoning is almost making me think of, even though Ahmed doesn't use this language of like whiteness, for example, as like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it is the idea of community, this is another quote, as being in common that generates shared attributes, which are then retrospectively taken as evidence of community. Again, self-fulfilling prophecy. Our task is not only to think about the generation of attributes, but to reconsider the politics of sharing. And this is one of those moments where Ahmed disrupts what might be an intuitive way of thinking about this. Sharing is usually thought of as something that has an exclusively positive valence. But in another bout of lexicographic thinking, Ahmed talks about sharing also means to have a share of something, or to share attributes implies division, right? If you say, oh well, I have my mother's hair, you're already chopping the body up into parts, right? And Ahmed talks about how reproduction depends on small moments of deviation, just enough not to go offline, right? Like you don't want to be. There's a sort of uncanny valley of this, right? The clone is disturbing because it's an exact copy, but if there's not any resemblance, that also disrupts this genealogical straightening device. So at the bottom of this page, 123, Ahmed talks about the relationship between inheritance and likeness. And she alludes here again to her previous work, The Cultural Politics of Emotion. And in that work, she suggests that likeness is an effect of proximity or contact, which is then taken up as a sign of inheritance, and that likeness is an effect of proximity rather than its cause, with the additional claim that we inherit proximities although this is an inheritance that can be refused. And I really appreciate how, at this point, as at other previous points, Ahmed pairs analysis of the institutional forces that direct our lives with the reflection that we have these moments of possibility in which we can refuse, we can err, we can wander, we can deviate. So, in short, for me, this means that for Ahmed, we're guided in certain directions, but we're not fated. We are born into a set of proximities and distances, as Ahmed would put it, as an effect of historical work, such as the reproduction of whiteness. But we're not exclusively fated to reproduce it or live out its implications. And for me, this gives it a hopeful aspect. So, Ahmed, quote, to suggest that we inherit proximities is also to point to how that past is behind our arrival restricts as well as enables human action, right? So moving on to 124, but continuing with this thread of resemblance and likeness, Ahmed reflects on the phrase like two peas in a pod. And for her, this is an example of how likeness is not in the peas. It's not in the pod, but it's an effect of their contiguity, right? And Ahmed talks about wanting to sidestep a framework of nature versus nurture, or, I'm more familiar with this from gender theory, the idea of like social constructionism, versus biological essentialism is how these sides get pitted against each other. Rather, for Ahmed, she wants to think about contingency, contact, touch as a shaping force, wherein what is near and therefore in contact or available for contact is the condition of our arrival in the world. So with likeness in mind, she turns back to race, the familial as familiar, the world we implicitly know. 125, in this world, the family itself becomes what we implicitly know, as well as what surrounds us, a dwelling place. And so at this point, we return to the language and conceptual framework that I was talking about in my video for Chapter 2 on sexual orientation. This is this framework that Ahmed gets from an early work by Marx and Engels called The German Ideology. And so here Ahmed's talking about how we might even say that we inherit the family as a form. The nuclear family only appears as a fetish. And although she does deal both with Freud and Marx in this chapter, I think this is right now the Marxist conception of fetish. The nuclear family only appears as a fetish available in its sensuous certainty when we forget this history of work that allows the family to be given. Right? So this is a history of work that makes the family seem to be given. And then the family can become a vehicle, of course, for the work of reproducing whiteness. Ahmed, whiteness becomes a social inheritance. In receiving whiteness as a gift, white bodies, or those bodies that can be recognized as white bodies, come to possess whiteness as if it were a shared attribute. And that last clause is italicized because Ahmed loves to italicize. Have you noticed that? And that it's so important that this is in the subjunctive, right? Because if it were simply stated outright that whiteness is a shared attribute, then this runs the risk of reification, right? But whereas we're looking at it in this way where it has a social force, but it doesn't inhere in bodies, right? So, and then again, I'm reading this gift as a sort of Pandora's box of a gift, right? No, that's not right. There's hope at the bottom of Pandora's box. It's a bad gift, you know. Compulsory heterosexuality, bad gift. Whiteness, it's a bad gift. Um, so history too is framed as this kind of gift. History is a gift given that, when given, is received. Reception is not about choice, although neither is it simply passive. Yeah, 126, inheritance hides two meanings, to receive and to possess. In a way, we convert what we receive into possessions, a conversion that often hides the conditions of having been received, as if the possession is simply already there, and therefore we inherit the reachability of some objects. And so I think that this conversation about race as inheritance, and the process of receiving one's inheritance can be a process of disappearance, of relegating the work of appearance to something that's behind or below us, and that this is also, what Ahmed is alluding to. Reception is not about choice, although it is neither simply passive. This is a gift given forcefully, but it's also a gift that ultimately does require the assent, in some ways, of and the collaboration of the recipient. So I'm going to stop here for this video, and then in the next video we'll start up around end of 126, beginning of 127.